Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this live conversation. I will be representing Equality Bahamas in conversation with the Canadian High Commissioner, Emina Tudakovic. And it looks like we've had a little bit of an internet issue where our moderator dropped off. So we're just going to give Nicole a moment to get back. And while we wait, Emina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much, Alicia, for having me on. Very glad to speak with you today. So my name is Emina Tudakovic. I'm the Canadian High Commissioner to Jamaica and the Bahamas. So excited to have this conversation today. And also pleased you could take time after your 16 days, which I know have been really, really charged, to speak to me today. Thank you.
I'm really excited to speak to you, and I'm so glad we got to meet a little bit earlier and talk about 16 days. What has it been like in Jamaica? Because you're currently based in Jamaica, right? Have there been events going on? What's up?
I am based in Jamaica. So we did have our flagship event was on December 6th, which is also Canada's Day to mark the elimination of violence against women. It marks it was I think the 31st or the 32nd anniversary of a horrible crime that actually happened in, December 6, 1989, where a man murdered 22 women at a university who were taking engineering. So you've probably heard of that, but it's been a day marked in Canada by solemn remembrance. And I mean, usually at the universities, there's candlelight vigils and things like that, but it was an act of, femicide. He was targeting women. He split women and men and deliberately basically killed all the women who were trying to study engineering. And that's been kind of Canada's flagship is the wrong word, but it's been our National Day of Remembrance, which is usually quite well marked in Canada, and it's evolved a bit over the years. But
yeah, and it's generally referred to as the Montreal Massacre, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, we're gun violence is always shocking, but certainly in Canada, that scale is still one of our biggest ever kind of massacres ever in Canada, any gun event. So it was quite a significant. But the fact that it was clearly he was targeting them because they were women, there was no question about it, right? And he left extensive notes basically saying they're women engineers shouldn't exist, and it was clearly misogynistic. That was his goal. So
yeah, and we see how patriarchy and discriminatory stereotypes are at the root of violence against women and girls in just that incident and so many others since then and before then too.
No, for sure. I mean, I think it was like certainly everybody, I think, well, not everybody, but I think most people know that violence against women exists and people are aware of this and the roots for it. But this for Canadians in particular was shocking because it was so overt and it was so rooted, like so explicitly rooted in these are women. They shouldn't be, they shouldn't be engineers and they're ticking me off. Like that was it. I mean, obviously, he's not right in the head, but I think it was also, a wake-up call to the fact that, some, not all professions are as inclusive as they should be, certainly not 30 years ago. And there's a lot to be done. And as you mentioned, kind of the roots of patriarchy and the roots of where, it may seem like a slight sort of, they call them microaggressions, but it's not really, like it's what underpins everything else in the end. So, but yeah, that was quite shocking. We also took that occasion actually to launch. We have something called the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, and it's their small scale kind of micro almost development projects here in Jamaica, and many of them are rooted directly to assistance or programs to empower women and girls. One is for Jamaica has some women's shelters. The second one just launched recently, and it's a small scale kind of hydroponics therapy project. We've got another one empowering women coffee growers. It's a coffee cooperative. So another one is sort of targeting small businesses, including with a particular focus on women. And another one is for Transwave Jamaica. So it's our first LGBTQ plus group that we've been involved in a small scale. So so excited about those projects, and that was also partially the launch for that. So that was exciting. And then of course we've got our bigger kind of development projects, which are based largely out of here. I'll pause because I think our colleague is joining us.
Yeah, those projects sound amazing. I think she's still connecting to
Oh no,
audio. But
that's okay.
December 6th, though, was selected by, well, the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University coordinates 16 days of activism. And they chose December 6th as a day to recognize this issue of femicide and remember people who died, who were killed because of their sex or gender. So it's Femicide Awareness Day. And actually, the petition just launched yesterday on change.org to call for the day to be recognized by the United Nations so there can be a worldwide day of observation on December 6th. And like I said, the Montreal massacre, that date, that's the reason that that date was selected.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that actually. I mean, I know there's a lot of UN days, if that makes sense, but I didn't realize there wasn't a specific day against femicide, particularly given that the UN has been not just talking about it, but I think there's been a lot of concrete actions or attempts to move forward, but it doesn't, I mean, this is probably a longer conversation. It's not just up to the United Nations and to even when member states agree on which direction they're heading, because you have things like the Convention on like the CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination Against Discrimination Against Women, et cetera. Like you've got the legal international underpinnings, but what you don't have necessarily is the frameworks in the, in all the countries in the world, right?
Definitely. That's a struggle that we've had with international mechanisms that, the countries, the state goes off and signs these agreements and says, yes, we're going to do these things. And many times that isn't communicated to us at home on the ground. And we have no idea that we've signed on to CEDAW or the Convention on the Rights of the Child or what it means for us.
Yeah, for sure. I just paused in case Nicole was joining us.
Yeah, sorry about that. Morning.
No worries. Good morning.
So in terms of femicide in general, are there any things, I don't, how long have you been, in terms of the information that you've been seeing, is it concerning in terms of where you're from, seeing it from a Canadian perspective? Are you alarmed at some of the numbers that you're seeing and what you're seeing in the Caribbean?
I mean, it's an interesting way to phrase the question. Am I alarmed by some of what I'm seeing here? I always find it violence, including of course domestic violence or femicide, particularly alarming, no matter where it happens. And countries like Canada are certainly not immune. But I think what's I've been in Jamaica about a year. Been following the Caribbean news about that same time. It is shocking. I think there's a general high level of violence, which is shocking. What strikes me though is almost I wouldn't say normalization of it, but the fact that it's not as big a deal as I feel it should be sometimes when it's portrayed. And I think I almost feel like because it happens with so much frequency that people become not numb to it, but I think it's almost like, okay, it's domestic violence, she got into a fight with her boyfriend, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I'll just keep on going. We lost her again, but I think, we had, I think it was last spring here in Jamaica, we had some quite shocking news headlines, which I felt were problematic. And I think, Alicia, you and I, when we met in the Bahamas, talked about this, is that, 14-year-old girl was murdered by, I think, a man in his 30s. And the headlines were, girl murdered by her lover or woman murdered by her lover. And, I was like, okay, first of all, the headline should be, child murdered by pedophile rapist. That's what it should have been, right? Because she's a child. And thankfully, there's a lot of people wrote into the newspaper. People were shocked by this, but the fact that made it past the headlines, just sort of, just normalizing the fact that a 14-year-old could be dating a 30-year-old, like that's just not appropriate in any way. I'm not just saying this because I'm a mom and like, God help me if that's what happens. But I think, with COVID as well, the rise in violence, we know it's happening. I think this is what's shocking. So, I guess I've kind of expanded from your question, but there is a high murder rate amongst women. There's rampant violence. So I think this is something shocking and concerning, whether it happens in the Caribbean or anywhere else.
It's a good point you raised around the languaging, because I think, and what was great, I was telling Alicia that making the decision to use the word femicide was a really good choice, because naming something puts it front and center. And as you rightly say, the media sometimes downplays the severity of the issue, so people don't really recognize how important and serious something is. So definitely holding media accountable to what they're saying, and as you rightly said, how could it get past the editor for it to be phrased in that manner? That's a good point.
I'm going to get in trouble for that comment, I suspect, but it's okay.
No, it's actually a concern in the region that media needs to be phrasing things exactly, because sex with a minor is sex with a minor. It's statutory rape, and we need to call it
exactly. Yeah, but it's a look exactly, and in that case, it was at least statutory. Like, it's not even statutory rape; it's rape, right?
It is.
Given her age, and I think your point about language is a really good one, because words are very powerful, and femicide, and the linkages with genocide and the connotations, like, it's meant to be evocative, but I think. As I said at the beginning, we should continue to be shocked. Like, we should always be shocked. Like, we shouldn't be inured to the violence. And I know that when violence diminishes, that's something to be celebrated, but it's still not a good thing that it exists at all, right? And so I think that is an important point that you made about kind of, what words are being used when we discuss these issues at all.
Yeah. I would pose a similar question to you. The choice that Equality Bahamas made to use the word femicide, was that taken lightly? I mean, some people would say, well, that was the UN Women's theme, so they just take it. Was it a pointed decision? Was it something that you wanted to, in terms of the six actions that Equality Bahamas is now taking forward? What was that thinking decision like for you?
Yeah, I think we're always thinking about language and what words mean and how people understand things, and just recognizing that when we talk about violence against women, when we talk about gender-based violence, people want to know, why are we focusing on women? Why is this so important? And we also focus on seeing a full spectrum, because people view domestic violence in many cases as like just something that happens, like, that's a private thing. They just deal with that in their homes. But if it's over here on the spectrum, then the killing of people, of women and girls, because of their sex or genders on the other end of the spectrum, and we could always move along this spectrum. So we really wanted to give it a name, and we've actually been monitoring the use of the word femicide in Latin America and seeing the changes that have come about with people just becoming more aware of how many women really are murdered in this way and for this so-called reason, like what's underpinning it. And they, as we heard from Eugenia, who joined us from Mundo Sur, they've been engaging in this mapping exercise across, I think, 8 countries in Latin America to see how many women this is happening to. And when we classify things in this way, it makes it easier for us to collect data and for us to understand exactly what's happening, how prevalent it is. And if we actually see the stories themselves, we can probably find out how many of these people have tried to report before or tried to get help. How many of these people are, living with the person who killed them or not, or, is it a recent breakup? But being able to zero in on femicide in particular, the killing of women and girls on the basis of their sex or gender, would give us more information and help us to build better mechanisms for prevention as well as intervention.
Yes. So are we seeing, so you mentioned Latin America, are we seeing any particular types of trends in the Caribbean?
I think we are. I think it's harder to pinpoint because of the way that we name things. We kind of just report on things as it's a murder, it's a homicide, woman found dead, and a lot of times there's no follow-up. But I think in particular countries, we hear a lot about women and girls going missing and being murdered. I think in particular, we hear about it in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, but it's happening in other countries as well. And I'm not sure the reasons that we're hearing more about some countries than others. But in the Bahamas in particular, it sort of takes a very like strange, shocking story to get people to actually pay attention and ask some questions. And we've been going through that over the past few weeks, particularly with a woman who had a situation with this person. I don't know if it was her ex or if they were still together, but they had a situation where he stabbed her. He was, I think there was an order of protection. He was also in prison for a while. And a year later, he's abusing her again in the street in public, and then went to his car and ran her over with the car. And, you know, there were people there watching. Apparently some people tried to get the baby out of her arms. It sounds like they weren't successful, but he ran her over. And this is something that's seen as exceptional. People hear this story and it's like, oh my God, what is happening in the Bahamas? And those of us who are doing this work are looking at them like, oh my God, where have you been?
Right.
It's happening all the time. It's just not happening in this particular way where it's so sensational that it's going around WhatsApp groups, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, anything you want to add in terms of, I know Canada has been at some point, different points in time, focused on in terms of Indigenous women going missing, Indigenous women being targeted. Any thoughts on that from you?
I think, I guess just to back it up a bit, and I had flagged that, no country does very well. And I think Canada has done particularly poorly in terms of our Indigenous persons, including our Indigenous women in particular. And I think, some of the things that have come out when we've done, studies and looked into it, is it underscores, I guess it highlights the inequalities and there's a lot of different issues at play, right? It's not just that they were women, they're racialized women, they're a minority, they were economically disadvantaged. And that is why no one paid attention, or no one pays attention when they go missing. Because, let's face it, if I got kidnapped, okay, now I'm the High Commissioner of Canada, people would probably pay more attention. But if a white woman from a middle-class neighborhood disappears, people would pay attention. Whereas if an Indigenous girl who, maybe was a runaway, maybe she wasn't reported right away, people paid less attention, and that's just wrong, right? It's just wrong. But the fact is, it speaks to the structural issues as well, right? Person wasn't reported right away. Someone said, oh, she moved to a different province. She had run away from home or parent, and so I think for Canada, what it's underscored a lot is this sort of the economic, social, political issues that are at play when you have an issue like violence against women, including against Indigenous women. So it's not just, there's no excuse for the violence in any way, including the domestic violence, but there are the structural inequalities, economic issues, which lead people to become marginalized and less on the radar and less prevalent in terms of what society is doing. So I do think, in Canada, like you've heard as well about our issues we had with residential schools. We now have a national day on September 30th is Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, where it's meant to be, again, a time of reflection, but really kind of a restart on the relationship that Canada and Canadians have had with our Indigenous communities. So we have a long way to go, but I'm heartened by the fact that I really feel like there's a sincere desire to do better. But again, there are structural issues. Some of this can be responded to with training, of police forces, additional resources. You need structures in place for the women who want to leave. You need social services in place so you don't feel trapped where you are. It's not easy, but I certainly think, I do sense a sincere desire in Canada to do better, but it's going to take some time. Sincere desire and hope is never enough to kind of bring you forward. What you need is actually concrete action. And that's where we're still, baby steps, I think.
Right. So we have international mechanisms like CEDAW and bilateral. How do we see, and either of you could start the response to this one. So we have these international mechanisms. We have where countries are signatories and they've also ratified these conventions. Any thoughts as to where we could do better with them? Because we report to them in terms of CEDAW for sure. We report in terms of where we are some person said this year that if CEDAW was actually in play, women in particular wouldn't have been so hard hit with the inequalities that COVID has shown up. Any thoughts on how these international mechanisms are working for us, or are there spaces where you think that governments in particular could be a little more targeted towards ensuring that we get to some of the targets that we're supposed to?
Well, why don't I can start then if all international instruments are, CEDA at least is an actual, like it's an instrument, so it's technically legally binding, but very few of them have full enforcement mechanisms, and none of them have any real enforcement capacity behind them in reality. So, but where they are quite useful, one is that they set norms and standards. And I think that is really, really important because, you've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and these are the various treaty bodies that complement and support this. And we all know that, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not universally applied, but it's in some ways aspirational. It sets a kind of a minimum standard of what countries need to do and what nations need to do and what the international community wants to see in terms of the framework that's out there. Where I think countries like conventions like CEDAW are important is that, countries care what other countries think, right? So when you have a mechanism like CEDAW, which looks at a country, any country, including Canada, and kind of does a deep dive into how a country is doing in terms of that treaty body, it does give governments a framework for how they can best align themselves with what their commitments already are. So, but what it does take, I think, is those commitments to be highlighted. It's a useful tool for advocacy groups to sort of point out, hey, you've got this commitment under CEDAW, Article 4 or whatever, and your own legislation, for example, does not mirror that, et cetera. So it is a useful tool. In Canada, when we do have, and I've worked on that sort of the multilateral human rights side before, when we get these, we do take them very, very seriously, and we send it out to government departments and provinces and say, look, our legislation is not aligned, and how do we align ourselves? Because we do take the follow-up reporting really seriously. So I urge all countries to fulfill those commitments and to do as much as we can in terms of these treaty bodies. Of course, there are some gaps, like some of it's going to take a lot of time, especially some of the economic, social stuff. But it does allow a framework which sets a country into kind of the norms that other member states are upholding. So over to Alicia for.
Yeah, I think international mechanisms are really, really helpful, and it's really up to us how we use them at home. And I think this came up in a conversation in one of the 16 days events where, we had Marion Bethel, who was on the CEDAW committee of humanitarian law, talking about it and the importance of having these as a set of standards, as non-negotiables. Mm-hmm. This is something that should not take us forever to come into compliance with. And one of the issues I found with international mechanisms isn't actually with the mechanisms themselves, but with the way that they are presented at home. So it almost seems like people discover it in the midst of some sort of drama, or it seems as though there's something being imposed on the country. So here in the Bahamas, there's very much this idea that, this is a sovereign nation. The United Nations can't tell us what to do. We don't owe them anything. We can do our own thing. Who do they think they are? And not recognizing that the Bahamas is willingly participating. The Bahamas decided to join the United Nations. It decided to ratify CEDAW. There are other things that the Bahamas hasn't ratified. Why did it ratify CEDAW? It was a matter of choice. And it was also a matter of choice to do that and then come home and not talk about it and not let people know, this is what we did. Here is why. This is what CEDAW is. This is why it's important to us. This is how it's going to benefit us when we actually come into compliance with all of these articles. And here are the steps we're going to take to get there. But it's a secret. And anything that's secret or done behind closed doors, people get up in arms about it and concerned about what's going on and what's the agenda and are they trying to turn us into a different kind of country. So I think it's really important for the state to champion the treaty bodies that it signs onto. And right now that burden is disproportionately on NGOs to convince people that, no, this is important, this is a good thing, this isn't bad, this is going to help women, and by helping women, it helps everyone. And it's we're starting the race a lot later than naysayers, than the people who are really loud about their doubts and about their conspiracy theories. But if we can get out ahead of it, if the government can say to us, this is something that's on the table and we're going to sign it for these reasons, and here are the ways it's going to benefit us all, then people can actually buy into it. And it might still not be easy, but it would be a lot better than having something that's been sitting on a shelf for 20 years and all of a sudden everyone's talking about it because it's time for legal reform, or it's time for constitutional reform in the case of the Bahamas in 2016, where it went very, very badly, due in large part to the mystery around CEDAW and the mystery of the United Nations.
It's a good point, because it means that as if the government is kind of overbearing and saying, but we have to do this, but then when you have to roll it out, you need the citizens to assist you in rolling it out. So if they don't know what they have to do, it's going to be doubly hard to do that. So my question to you then, Alistair, is do you think that there are enough resources to support this work around gender equality and maybe eliminating gender-based violence?
I think the resources are out there, but they're not like here in this work that we're doing. So, I've been going over the concluding observations from the CEDAW committee in 2018 in particular, because we picked out 16 recommendations to highlight during 16 days. And in many of those recommendations, it's, you need to roll this out. You have this draft, you need to implement it. You need an action plan, but also you need the budget. You need resource allocation to get these things done. And part of the reason that these things sit on shelves is because there isn't a plan with a budget in place to get this work done. So we can talk about legal reform. For example, we need to criminalize marital rape. And that seems pretty straightforward. Let's get in there. Let's take out those last 5 words, which is what we're advocating for. Take out that in the definition of rape, take out who is not his spouse. So it includes married people. But we have these lobby groups that are against it. We have these people who believe that women are objects, women are owned by their husbands, women give consent forever and ever and ever when they get married. How do we come up against that? We have to have conversations about that. How do we do that? What money is there to hold town hall meetings, to produce pamphlets, to put out social media ads, to create PSAs that play during the news? That takes money. And so there has to be an allocation of resources, in particular financial resources, to back every single action that needs to be taken.
I mean, I know the High Commission has resources, some resources to do the work in the region. How do you see this being targeted specifically around this particular topic?
So there is, I mean, we obviously have quite a few projects, many of them which unfortunately don't directly benefit the Bahamas. We do have something called the Women's Voice and Leadership Project, which it's generally all over the Caribbean. It supports 27 women's rights and LGBTQ2+ groups. And it works to strengthen kind of their core programming. And Alicia, I think you raised the point about the resources, but it's you can't always just work out of your basement, right? Like you kind of need an office at some point and a computer and to really be effective advocates. So that's one kind of our major project that's been going on for a few years. And really the idea is to kind of build that collective voice and power. Like we're not telling you what to do, but we're targeting our money to groups that are aligned with Canada's Feminist International Feminist International Systems Policy. There's something called the Inter-American Task Force on Women's Empowerment and Leadership, and Canada's given money to that as well. And it's basically inter-American UN institutions, which is basically, again, trying to increase women's political representation and leadership just through engagement. So, we're trying to advance these things and trying to, sometimes as well by I think for Canada, the signal of having a feminist international assistance policy and a feminist foreign policy was our placeholder internationally, saying this is what Canada stands for. We will support women and girls. We will support gender equality, and this is what we're working for. And obviously we don't. there's a delicate balance in terms of what you advocate from within countries themselves. But what we're saying is, this is what Canada stands for. We will support you on this. And this is something that we think is really important, because it is, that question of resources is really thorny, because where you have people who are unaware of the issues or don't think it affects them, one of the surest ways to get people moving along is to educate them, knowing that, giving people equal rights does not take rights away from you in any way, right? And I think this is where people get scared. They hear this and they think, what is the UN saying? Or what is someone like Alicia saying? Like, oh, like, she's clearly got some strange agenda, but it's not. What we're trying to say is, look, think about this in terms of really what's being talked about, because it also affects you, right? It affects men, it affects boys, it affects women, it affects girls, it affects people who are, of any gender. Like, and I think people don't, I think that's what makes it scary, right? And I mean, during the COVID pandemic, we've all seen some of the stuff on social media where this is all a massive UN conspiracy and all, and you think, if people can believe that, hopefully you can get them to believe that having equal rights or outlawing something as frankly abhorrent as marital rape is really not an issue. Like, this is not in any way going to diminish what you already have. It's actually going to make things better. And
so, in one way to align resources in terms of possible priority issues, Equality Bahamas talked about, like we talked about data collection in one of the sessions. Is it possible to address either one specific topic, Alicia, or maybe some smaller low-hanging fruits over the next year? What do you see as Equality Bahamas as possibly priority issues for the next year?
Well, marital rape has been a priority issue for us for a while, so we're definitely highlighting that. We're also looking at the need for compliance with and public education on international mechanisms. So we're looking specifically at CEDAW, which is basically the Women's Bill of Rights, and Belém do Pará, which we don't talk about enough, which is on eliminating violence against women. And most people have never even heard of the convention. So we need to do a lot of education on that. And like I said earlier, making it relevant to people's lives, because a lot of things people sort of bypass or think are unimportant because they don't understand how would it affect me? What does that mean for my household or for my children, especially people who are already in situations of vulnerability and have their own sort of running calculations in their head all day, how I'm going to get $3-4 extra to be able to go to the store to get a couple of tins of tuna to feed these children. They don't have time to sit down and learn about CEDAW. So how are we going to make it easy? How are we going to make at least one of these articles something that people can sort of hold on to and be a part of building people power and creating the political will for the government to take particular actions? Really want to focus on that, creating resources to make these international mechanisms more relevant, more understandable, and producing sort of bite-sized pieces around them. Again, marital rape is a huge thing. And we're also looking at the ratification of ILO's Convention 190, which is on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. Seeing that as really important. And that's continuing from last year's 16 Days campaign, where the focus was on the workplace, violence in the workplace. And I think that we have an opportunity here to work with employers. If we can get some human resource managers, some business owners on board to recognize C-190 and see what they can do to further the protection of their staff, and to understand that their responsibility to their staff isn't just in the building, but ensuring that, if someone is going through domestic violence, that the person who is abusing them isn't allowed to enter the building. That calls can be screened, that if they need leave, they can get it, especially if they need to leave a volatile situation. Understanding that they might need some flexibility in being able to work from home in case they're afraid of being followed. All these different adjustments that can be made and that we know can be made, especially in a pandemic, seeing how things have changed so much when employers were motivated to keep people working so that they can keep making money. So I think we need to expand our thinking about this and expand, I guess, our audience, and recognize that it's not just government, but we can work with other groups. We can work with faith-based organizations, for example. We can work with employers. We can work with service clubs to get people to be more fluent in the language of some of these conventions.
You brought in COVID a little bit. Has there been any major disturbances that COVID? I mean, yes, there's money that is being reallocated to the COVID response, but has COVID really shot up numbers in terms of gender-based violence in Bahamas, or what have you all been seeing? What trends have you been seeing in that?
From what we've seen, yes. Again, data is a serious issue here, but the Bahamas Crisis Center has reported a stark increase in calls to the hotline. I know that I've personally and through Equality Bahamas received a lot of calls, particularly in the first, I guess, 3 to 4 months of the pandemic, calls from women who are trapped at home with abusers. You know, this idea, people had this slogan that safe at home. Everyone is not safe at home. And for so many people, home is the most dangerous place. And when you're trapped at home and you're usually, you know, if you're used to the person coming home angry or drunk or whatever at a certain time, you know, you can grab your car key and head over to your sister for a few hours and come back when he's asleep. But if there's a 9 o'clock curfew,
right,
you're stuck. What are you supposed to do? And this is something that Equality Bahamas warned the government about. We actually worked with, as a part of the Feminist Alliance for Rights, to write basically policy guidelines around COVID-19 in 9 different areas. So we looked at food insecurity, for example, we looked at health issues, and we looked at abuse of power, just as examples. And people can find it at tiny.cc/feminist statement, but it really outlines some of the things that we could sort of foresee and ways that states, as they implement these pretty drastic measures to, what was the phrase? Deal with the curve.
Yeah, flatten the curve.
Flatten the curve, yes.
Yeah.
That those measures don't cause harm to people. We understand that it's going to be rough, it's not going to be comfortable, but can we at least not cause harm to people? And can we think about and center people who are in situations of vulnerability, and not center ourselves, like people who are kind of in the middle and like we'll fumble through, but what about people who don't have running water? How are they supposed to be in lockdown
right,
for 2 weeks? Are you going to deliver water to them? Are they going to get food deliveries for people who have to go to the store every day and can't do a big, you know, 1 week or 2 week grocery shop? Just kind of trying to train people to think in these ways. And that's why we need feminist policy. So that's something that we tried to get ahead of. Again, the government didn't pay attention until the Crisis Center started talking about this increase in numbers, and there was some concern. And in those first few weeks of press conferences, reporters started asking the Prime Minister and I believe also the Ministry of Health about the effects, about the increase in domestic violence. And they were just non-answers. It was sort of like, well, the police department is there, people can call the police. You know, that's not sufficient.
no, it isn't. I mean, for the High Commission, are there any specific priority areas that you all are looking at, just given what's current? Are there any priority areas from the High Commission?
So I've spoken a bit already about our feminist foreign policy. So that's kind of our overarching. So everything we do has to have a gender lens as well. And that one thing that's interesting, it's been probably maybe even more than 20 years that any legislation or policy that Canada enacts, like so any domestic legislation has to have a gender-based analysis. So if you write a memo to cabinet where you're looking for money, it has to include, you know, you have to have looked at the gender lens to see how will this policy affect women and men differently? Do you have to do something proactively to change how it will affect what the policy does? So that's actually one of these things that, you know, we have that in our development policy as well. But the fact that in Canada for the last 20 years, at least because it started when I joined government, I was well aware of it when I joined government, it would have been fairly new. That's something that allows you to think about that. So when you're thinking about something, Alicia, you were talking about the lockdowns, you know, I think few countries, including Canada, had thought about what the immediate effect was. As you said, like you think, okay, there's a virus, we're going to be locked down for 2 weeks. If everyone just stays home, the thing will go away and we'll go back to life as normal. But what it did underscore is that life isn't kind of usual and normal for everybody, right? It underscored the importance of the most poorly paid workers to keep our food shelves stocked, you know, and it underscored the fact that, as you said, not everybody's safe at home. You know, and if you're privileged enough to be able to buy 2 weeks of groceries and stock your fridge and freezer, and you know you have a fridge and a freezer and you have electricity, it's one thing. So, I mean, in terms of priorities, you know, I think Canada recognizes that you're not going to achieve full gender equality overnight. It's been a long process. Some of what I think, Alicia, when we were in the Bahamas, you were describing, and when I talked to others in the Bahamas, this is some of the stuff that we were going through 30, 40 years ago. I remember, I think I was in university, my mother went to open a bank account and they wanted my dad's signature. And this was like 25 years ago. And this is not that long ago, 25 years ago, it's the, what, 19, I guess I was in university in 1998 or something like that. And it was ridiculous. And, she had realized, she's like, wow, we've never had a non-joint bank account. And so it's kind of a small, like not small, but even in Canada, there's been steps, but it has improved. So the issue you raised as well about harassment in the workplace, when do you recognize that this is a wrong issue? Like, you need those voices. And I think when you talk about priorities for Canada, again, it's, we're trying to empower people to raise their voices in this regard, because that's how things have moved forward in Canada. And I think, Nicole, you had raised that point just about, or maybe it was Alicia, sorry, about the businesses and things like that. Like, I think you also have to speak to people in a language that speaks to what their priorities are, right? So if you're a business, you need to convince them that actually having a workplace that is harassment free is actually much better for business than one that is full of harassment, right? And I think this is where people don't see kind of the bigger picture, is that you don't realize that if you had an environment where women were equal, their access to employment was equal, their access to education was equal, that you would actually do better. Countries that have more female participation in parliament, I'm thinking of the Nordic countries, for example, they tend to do better. They do better economically, they do better socially. I'm not saying they're perfect, but there's, you're looking at peace processes. Like, if women are at the table when you're doing peace agreements, they tend to hold. Whereas if it's only men talking about, they don't hold. So I feel I've gotten a bit off task in preaching to the choir about all these things, because this is where we should be heading. But I do think it's countries like Canada have realized that this is a long-term process and that we need to keep on chipping away at it. And this is where our foreign policy is now, and this is where it's certainly going to be heading in the next few years in terms of the development assistance we do, and in terms of what we support as well in the international arena.
Definitely preaching to the choir. So I know that's in terms of the collective age in the room, in terms of how long persons have been doing this work. Do we possibly see a win, or how will we win? What are some of maybe the mindsets, the resources? We talked about structures like CEDAW and BED and Blue Para, and yes, recognizing that some of these mechanisms people don't know. And I think, you really talked about how do we then interpret the quote unquote heavy language from on top to the layperson in the street who needs to recognize, how does this impact me directly? Also to the point where I also to recognize that a lot of people seem to think that to give someone else rights means that I have to give them a right of mine. Not recognizing that I've always had these rights. And governments may not make the decision to ensure that all citizens understand that everybody is supposed to have rights within these specific countries. Do you think that gender equality is achievable? Do you think that the elimination of gender-based violence is achievable? As I said, I know it seems as if the three of us have this collective knowledge in the room, and we've been working at it for a while. Do we see any lights at the end of the tunnel? Is it still something that we still have to, wipe the smudge off the glass still to get the light first and then crack the glass? What are those? First of all, Alicia, has there been any wins for Equality Bahamas?
Oh, that's a rough one.
I remember a local activist here saying, sometimes we have to celebrate the small wins. And that will take us forward. So that's why I'm asking, have you seen any wins?
Yeah, it's something that we've been, as a team, that we've been talking about and trying to figure out, how we can identify these smaller things, like being able to get a certain number of people out to an event. I think a small win has been being able to build a community that shows up for Women's Wednesdays every month. I mean, it seems like a small thing, but there are people who consistently show up because they really want to participate in these conversations. They share it, they want to bring family members, back when it was in person, and now that it's virtual, being able to reach Bahamians in the diaspora has been really great, because I find that when you leave the space, you see it in a different way. And when you experience another space, you get ideas and you kind of have a vision for what your home or the place that you're going to return to could be. So I think really building community has been a major goal of ours, and we've been able to do that on a small scale. So it's something that we want to keep building on. And I think becoming sort of the go-to on issues of gender and sexuality and human rights, being the one that people call when they need help, when they need to access a resource, or when, even a reporter needs a quote, understanding that since we started in 2014, we've sort of become a name that people know to go to, and also seeing that as a responsibility and an opportunity to keep providing resources, because even though you might not see people showing up to your event, it's clear that they're paying attention. And really, we're really viewing this work as being more than just about the government. I think when we started, it was really focused on government advocacy, and now we're recognizing that the political will isn't there, we have to create it, and that means engaging with people and getting people to ask for the things that we want and the things that we know that we all need. So being on the ground, having an audience that's expanding and it's learning along with us, I think is a win.
Good. Thanks for that. Emina, you've been here a couple of years in the region. Have you been seeing any shifts in how governments or people in general operate with the High Commission?
So I'm still fairly new here. So it's been about a year, and it's been a COVID year, which I feel is both compressed and then in that weird time-space continuum of the COVID era. I think not necessarily shifts. I mean, I think it's still, I've been surprised sometimes at how provocative it is when you mention something like LGBTQ2 rights. That's one thing I found shocking coming here. I was actually really surprised, because certainly in Canada, by and large, it's accepted as it's just not an issue. Do you know what I mean? So me saying that I support gay marriage, or that trans women are women too, like that is like not an issue in Canada. And so to come here and have it to be so shocking, that threw me. The other thing I've been surprised, and I certainly didn't find this in Jamaica as much, because I had a news interview and I said I was a feminist, which I am a feminist, and I have to admit, I sometimes despair at when saying you're a feminist became kind of the new F word, right? Like this is not a bad thing to say. I've been saying this since I was in my, in university, and I kind of finally figured out what it should be or what it is. So I think, colleagues have said that they see a bit of a shift to more openness and more discussion. I think this is where it starts. And, Alicia, you talked about, it's not just about government, it's about people's attitudes. And I think people often are scared by what they don't see and what they don't know as well, right? It's not an excuse necessarily, but if you've never met someone who's gay, and all you've ever heard about is what you've heard from, your great uncle who, sends you WhatsApp messages about how this is terrible. You don't actually know what this means, right? And I think in Canada, if you look at sort of trends in Canada, where I think it was something like 20, 30 years ago, gay marriage would have been unthinkable in Canada and support for it was low. And now it's actually really, really high. And it's legal and it's not. And I think there was a shift because people realized that, allowing gay marriage does not diminish the rights of other people. And same as allowing women to work in all fields on an equal footing and not to be harassed at work. It doesn't diminish the work of someone else who's in that field. So one thing I haven't really talked about is kind of I think more and more men speaking out. And I've seen this in some of the media here. I've been quite heartened by, men penning opinion articles about the need to ensure access, for example, to sexual reproductive health, right? And it's powerful in some ways coming from a man as well, saying, hey, this is something I've thought about as, a man, as a husband, as a father, this is important. So so I can't really speak to how much mindsets are changing, but I think there is that advocacy certainly that we've seen. On your question about how will we win, I think that was the phrasing. It's funny because there's that part of me that tends to be a bit of a not being provocative. It's like, yeah, we should win. We will win because this is the right. This is what should win, right? But there is a part of me that's a bit uncomfortable because it's not actually a zero-sum game. It's not a competition, right? It's all about, if you're looking at equal rights and you're looking for equal access, then we all win, right? We're not taking away from others by advocating for equality. So I think, just organizations like Equality Jamaica or some of the other groups Equality Bahamas, there's also Equality Jamaica. These grassroots organizations are really important because you start to change that dialogue, and you start to get people thinking about this because it's stuff they didn't think about very much at all. Do you also need, I think you do need the government on your side, because you do need to start making it a priority for government, which means that you make it something that people consider when they look at policy, when they look at the electoral base. And one way to change that is to to have people voting when they're supporting policies that will push that agenda along. And of course, certainly in terms of kind of that technical assistance, that the things that, for example, we've done with Women's Voices in Leadership, this is what you need. You need people to kind of be working in a framework where they can be raising issues in a consistent, steady manner, because that's where you get your issues heard. So that's kind of another long-winded answer to your fairly simple, perhaps, question. But
I'm glad you brought in things like allies, because I remember when I was in Canada, I attended Purple Walks, I attended Take Back the Night. Alicia, how do we work with the allies? What type of allies have you found useful in the work?
This has always been a tricky spot for me, because I've had to really build patience, but because there are so many groups that should be or could be allies. They just need to kind of get over a hump of certain things. And I think most interesting for me has been engaging with men who really believe in gender equality and who want to see gender-based violence ended, like completely eliminated, and are actively asking, what can I do? How can I help? And they're prepared to talk to their peers and talk to their family members. And I think we need to find these people and we need to have answers when they ask the question, because the first couple times I got the question, I was kind of like, talk to people, but they're looking for more concrete things. They want to do more high impact things. So, I mean, that's an area of growth for Equality Bahamas for sure, because this year for 16 days, we had a conversation that was just between men, for men. And it was a great conversation. Those of us that watched were like, wow, they really had a lot to say. They made some really solid points. This is what we need more consistently, a space for men to be able to talk and to hear from other men. We also have connections with a couple of people in faith-based organizations. So Reverend Kelly Jolly joined us for a conversation about community responses to gender-based violence. And I think faith-based organizations are one of the best sets of spaces to work in and to have these conversations, because they already have groups. They already have like prayer circles and choir and the people who do stuff for the sick and needy. They're already in groups, they're already meeting. And these conversations are happening offside, but they're happening without us. And they're a lot of times happening without the critical information. So I think it's important for us to figure out how we can engage with these groups, even in a space where we have some fundamental differences. So I think navigating those differences, but also recognizing the space that we have to work together and seeing the people who are the movable middle.
Right. Mm-hmm. Amina, I'm thinking the High Commission as an allied organization. Mm-hmm. How do you see, and if there are any spaces that you would want to be allyship to, mm-hmm. or a shift in thought around mm-hmm. the High Commission? Any thoughts on that?
It's always a bit tricky for us in terms of advocacy, because we can't, we sort of can't tell local governments what to do. So for my part, it's something I've given a lot of thinking, even just in the last couple of years, because there's been quite a few issues that have been brought to the forefront in Canada, including race relations, the Indigenous people, the feminist issues have been sort of one of the early things that I kind of came into myself personally, and I think what is difficult sometimes is you wonder, like, how best can you be an ally and how can you be constructive, right? And it's always that awkwardness of, I don't want to tell people how to suck eggs, but I think just having those conversations and supporting a space for those conversations is really important. And where I'm coming around to is, like, I tend not to be like, I don't want to be in people's faces. Do you know what I mean? I'm always trying to be kind of pleasant about things, and you want to be encourage discussion. And I'm realizing I'm much less afraid to be slightly provocative as well, in terms of, and not provocative, but being really upfront with what I believe and what Canada's position is, because it is going to step on some toes and it's going to ruffle some feathers, but there's nothing wrong with that, because I think it pushes a bit that agenda. And agenda is maybe again a word that worries people, because they think there's some hidden agenda. It's not. It's a really simple, basic agenda about having equal rights, and even bringing it back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is what it's about, and we know that's not what's happening. And so I think, even conversations like this, or some of the conversations we have during the 16 days, and some of the things I'd like to do in the next year, allowing a space for discussion, allowing that support is a way that we can move this forward. And knowing, I mean, we've had these discussions around flying the pride flag, which we're planning to do this year. Once we, Alicia heard my funny tale about we need to get our flagpole fixed, but it's a real logistical issue. But we'd like to do that for the first time this year here in Kingston. And I know it's going to ruffle feathers, but it's really about showing that you have support from Canada. Right. So, Canada believes that this is the right thing to do. We believe in equal rights, and it's going to make some people angry, but it's not about that. It's really about kind of signaling that at a greater level. And just finally, I think, Alicia, you spoke about faith-based groups and other groups that are already organized. I think that's really key, because I think, people don't always actually understand the issues. Like, they really don't. Like, I think people, if you've, joke about kind of the bubble you live in, right? So if you live in a bubble where, you've never been abused, and, you've been, you've had like a really, like, you may have just never really experienced, like you just don't see it. Like, you don't see it past your own paradigm, right? Or it's always been hidden. And I like to think that people, like, once they get aware of issues, will realize that it's wrong and that they need to act. I mean, that's not the case for everybody, and I know I'm being a bit naive there, but I think really, underscoring that for people, saying, hey, do you realize that in your community, that your nice community, probably 1/3 of women have experienced abuse at some point? Like, think about this, like, and, kind of drawing those lessons home, because people really, they're like, well, I don't abuse people. But it's not, like, I've always found it unhelpful when people say not all men. Like, no one's saying it's all men. Like, that's ridiculous, right? But what it's saying is you have to acknowledge that it could be someone that's an abuser, and it could be someone that that is being abused, and it's not just something to be hidden or silenced. Right?
Thank you so much, Emina. Thank you so much for the time that you will be willing to spend with us. We have to wrap it up. Any closing comments from you?
No, not really. I feel like I've gone a bit all over the place on my soapbox. My husband does joke about my soapbox, but it's fine, because I do consider him an ally. so it's totally fine. But I think, I'm heartened by discussions of this, because, as I said, like, I feel obviously like-minded group here, but I think it's just raising those issues so people realize, again, it's not something scary we're talking about. These are real issues. The issues are scary, right? Femicide is scary. Violence against women is scary. But what we're talking about is, how do you move that bar so where it's unacceptable, where perpetrators are punished, where there are safe spaces for women, where you have this basis of equality, both of opportunity and equality of of just life, so that none of this is normalized. And I think it's the way forward to move to societies which are healthier and happier and more prosperous in general. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'll stop here so I can get Alicia to have a last word, and you as well, Nicole.
Thanks so much, Alicia.
I am just really looking forward to where we go beyond 16 days. There are so many things that we've talked about over the past few days, many issues raised and some ideas for where we can go to sort of elevate these issues and start to build some solutions. I think there are some people that kind of tuned into the conversation, maybe for the first time, or maybe for the first time in a very concentrated way, who are ready to do the next thing. And that's really what 16 days of activism against gender-based violence is about. It's about kind of lighting a fire and getting people to become more interested and see their part, see that there's a role for them to play in moving this work forward and in eliminating gender-based violence. So I'm really looking forward to taking it 365 days and working with the different embassies and high commissions to see what we can do together, because we know that diplomacy is really important in these processes, multilateralism and shared values. And I think that there's a lot that countries can learn from each other. I mean, Emina talked about the feminist policy and using that to undergird and to guide all other legislation. I think that's something that all of our countries in the region and probably all over the world can learn from. And even NGOs can learn from that and be able to use it in our own advocacy and put together some tools for everyone in our community to understand what it means to take these kinds of approaches to laws and how it benefits everyone. So I think there's a lot of room for NGOs to work with diplomats and figure out how we can promote and expand human rights.
Thank you both. Thanks, Alicia. So I just want to say thanks to both of you for spending the time, just an hour, and I hope persons would have been open enough to hear some of the things that were said and to really, I think, Alicia, when you always talk about this 365 days moving forward, it's really is, how do we take each day and maybe takes one thing and make a decision to change that. So I want to thank you both for the time that you spent and the issues and ideas that were shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.